Imagine you're sitting across the table from a murderer. There's no one around. It's just the two of you. You look them in the eye and you ask them, why'd you do it? They tell you their story, and they had their reasons. They were out of options. They were poor. They had to feed their family. And by the way, the person they killed, that was a bad person. They had it coming. There's nobody that's going to miss them. And think of all the good that you could do if you had what they had. All you had to do was be brave enough to take it from them. In fact, you think about it, and if you were in their shoes, you may have done the same thing. But here is the question. Was it wrong? Are morals absolute or are they arbitrary? Every rule has exceptions, right? Maybe we can be the author of our own values, like Nietzsche said, let ourselves off the hook. Can you do something wrong for the sake of a greater good and get away with it? That is the question that Dostoevsky goes after in his book, Crime and Punishment. It's my favorite book of all time because it addresses these big questions, and that's what I'm going to get into in this video. So first, we need to get to know the main character, Raskolnikov. He's an impoverished law student who recently has dropped out because he can't afford his tuition. He's holed up in this miserable little apartment, and actually, when we meet him in the novel, he's trying to avoid his landlady because he can't even afford his rent. He's brilliant, you can't deny that, but he's arrogant, he's self-absorbed, and more importantly, he's lazy. The maid who tends to his room, one day she asks him, if you're so clever, why are you sitting around here all day with nothing to show for it? And he's like, I'm working. And she says, well, what are you doing? What type of work are you doing? And he says, I'm thinking. And that's all he does is sit in his room and think. He's like one of these incels that are holed up in the room, not doing much of anything. And by the way, if that's not bad enough, he's physically sick as well. Something has been ailing him for the past couple of months, and he's been kind of withering away. So by all measures, things aren't going well for him. And then you have his friend, Raskolnikov. And I think I'm saying that right. Some of you got onto me in another video for messing up the names, so I'm trying to do better. But Raskolnikov is crucial to really getting to know who Raskolnikov really is. Now, we've already made the case for why Raskolnikov is suffering. He's in a bad spot, for sure. And typical social constructionists, they take one look at this guy, his environment, and say, well, that explains everything. He's a victim of his socioeconomic position, obviously. However, Raskolnikov is in the exact same situation as Raskolnikov is, but he handles it very differently. He's poor. He's also a law student that can't afford his classes. He had to drop out. But he's working as hard as he can to return to his studies. He supports himself with these odd jobs, and still by no means is he well off. In fact, he spends a whole winter in Russia, mind you, without lighting his stove to stay warm. But he makes the best of it. He says that he likes it better because he sleeps better in the cold. He's a man about town. He's good-humored. He's healthy. He's strong. He's optimistic. He doesn't let his circumstances define him. And Raskolnikov despises him for it because Raskolnikov is a reminder of his own failures, and he doesn't want to take accountability for that. This victimization that he is cultivating often gets overlooked in our time when we tend to blame unequal outcomes solely on the material conditions without any regard for how individuals approach their circumstances. And I think that's important to point out here. And Raskolnikov's approach is really interesting. He's ashamed of his circumstances, and he doesn't want people to see that. So what he does, he wants to play the part of the wealthy patron. He's really eager to put himself into these situations where he feels important and noble and generous. But the thing is, you can't be generous without having something to give first. And what he does, his mother and his sister, by the way, they're basically back home almost in a state of servitude to this really bad guy. And they're sending what little money they do make to Raskolnikov so that he can afford his tuition. They have no idea that he's dropped out of school. He's essentially been living off of their labor, and he routinely squanders it for his own self-aggrandizement. One day he runs into this family that's being evicted. The dad's a drunk. He's useless. He's in trouble with the law. But Raskolnikov, who can't even afford his own rent, sees this, and he pays the family's rent. And he walks away feeling all good about himself. He's thinking about what a good person he is. And then he realizes, what in the world am I doing? That wasn't even my money to give. And it's that misplaced, unearned benevolence that keeps him stuck in the mire. But he's too proud to overcome it. See, Raskolnikov's hero is Napoleon. For him, Napoleon is proof that might defines right. Nothing is sacred, nothing is divine. And as far as he's concerned, the world is just a zero-sum game between the powerful and the powerless. And he doesn't want to end up on the wrong side. And we'll see how that plays out later in the story. So now he needs money, and he goes to a pawnbroker to pawn a lot of things. His father's watch, a gold ring that his sister gave him, and the pawnbroker is this horrible old lady. She's ugly, she's hostile, she's hoarded all this wealth by taking advantage of desperate people. And on top of that, she's also abusive to this poor young girl that works for her. She gives him pennies on the dollar for his things, and he leaves, takes his money. Obviously, the first place he goes is down to the tavern for a drink, continuing to waste the little money that he does have. And he starts to think. And Dostoevsky writes, a strange idea was beginning to peck at his brain like a chicken in the egg. Some idea is taking shape in his mind, and that idea has been incubating there for quite a while. And he decides that maybe he should kill that old woman and take her money for himself. After all, I mean, remember, Crime and Punishment was written only a few years after Nietzsche said that God is dead. And Dostoevsky created Raskolnikov to put that claim to the test. If there are no values, no absolute truths, if all there is power, why not commit a small crime? So he gets into a conversation with an officer over drinks who's there with him. And he shares this idea. Theoretically, of course, he's like, what value would a sickly old lady add to the world? She's worthless. She's a cockroach. In fact, she's even worse than that because she's actually robbing people blind. She's actually doing harm. I'd be doing the world a favor. I could do a lot of good with her money. And the officer, he's not really taking him very seriously, but he's entertained by all this and a little curious. So he asks him if he's actually planning to kill the woman. And Raskolnikov says, of course not. Of course not. I'm just saying it would be justified if it were to happen. And the officer thinks about that for a moment and says, well, if you wouldn't do it yourself, it must not be very justified. And there's a really important thing going on here. When people tell you what they think and what they're motivated by, listen to them. Take them for their word. If a person or a group says that they want to destroy Western culture, for example, that's what they mean. And the cause of justice that they claim to be standing for is just a vehicle that they chose to accomplish their goal. It's the means for them to attain their end. When I talk to people about Marxism, for example, or Black Lives Matter, or any other radical activism, I hear them say things like, well, you're strawmanning the argument, or, you're taking what they say out of context. But when I hear that, it's obvious to me that they haven't actually read the Communist Manifesto or the mission statement of the group that they support, because I'm literally restating word for word what the manifesto says, what their mission statement says. They've just never read it. And if they have, they're overlooking the actual words for the sake of what they believe to be a noble cause. And this brings us back to that question of, can you do something wrong for the sake of a greater good? Look, the story of the 20th century is godless men trying to prove that force is justified if it aligns with a noble aim. We have plenty of wars, millions of dead bodies to prove that. And what we realized is it's not the case. You don't get to justify the means for the sake of the end. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's not true. Everybody hasn't recognized that. We can see clearly, even in recent times, in the highest positions in our society, in our universities, there's still people who believe that harboring murderous intent is permissible and that it's only problematic if it's actionable. That is the case that Raskolnikov makes here in the book, and all the way up to the point of action. He never actually thinks he's going to carry out his plans. He just likes to ponder on them and think about them. Dostoevsky is pointing out how ideas have a tendency to take hold of you, and it's easy to get out from under them in the beginning. But the more time goes on, the more you ponder, the more time you spend with these ideas, the more entrenched you become, and the harder it is for you to separate yourself from the consequences. He has this incredible line where he says, "It's as though a part of the clothing that he was wearing had got caught in a wheel of a machine, and he was being drawn into it. The more that the gears turn, the more entrenched you become until you're stuck, and eventually it's not up to you anymore. You've been captured by your ideas." So before I move on, spoiler alert, if you want to read the book first, you should pause the video now. I think it's kind of obvious what's going to happen, but I'll give you 3 seconds here. Okay, so he does it. He kills the old lady, and he winds up killing the young girl that works for her as well. He didn't plan on that. It just kind of happened, and a few people get accused, but none of them are him. So it looks like he's going to get away with it, except for that officer that he was talking to in the pub earlier in the story. His name is Porfiry, and it seems like Porfiry knows that Raskolnikov did it, but he doesn't really seem interested in trying to investigate and prove that he did it. It's almost like he knows that eventually he's going to have to come clean. It's just a matter of time. And that's meaningful to point out. Just because you rationalize something doesn't mean that your conscience is going to let you get away with it. And that is a symbol that Porfiry stands for throughout the story. So Raskolnikov, he tries to justify what he's done to himself and to everyone else. And here's his argument. He says, if society was just organized correctly, crime would end like that. All you need is some mathematical brain to organize things properly. And, reading that today in 2024, it sounds a lot like what we're trying to accomplish right now with AI. If everything is just material and determined, then we can calculate it. And the thing is, whoever makes the best calculator, they're the ones that get to run the show. But Dostoevsky, 150 years ago, he points out that the soul doesn't obey the laws of physics. And that's inconvenient for people that want to create society based on control, based on the idea that we are just biological machines without agency. And one of my favorite lines speaks to that. He says, the commune is ready, but human nature isn't ready for the commune. And Raskolnikov isn't ready to handle the consequences of his own actions. If he was sick before, now with all this guilt, he's even worse off. He can't even get out of bed. His mother and his sister, they come to visit him, to check on him. And his sister, she tells him that she's going to marry that guy that they work for. His name is Peter, so that she can afford to keep sending Raskolnikov money. And by the way, Peter is not the type of person that you would want your sister to marry. He's actually, interestingly enough, he's very similar to Raskolnikov. So time goes on, the investigation continues to unfold, and it turns out Raskolnikov has been making the case to justify what he had done way before he actually committed the murder. See, he had written this article in a law magazine 6 months earlier, and in that article, he outlined everything, his motives, his actions, the consequences of his actions. He's been so self-absorbed in his own solipsism that he didn't even know that it got published. Porfiry discovers the article and he shows it to Raskolnikov and he says, look, you analyzed the psychology of a criminal. You said that there are certain people that have the right to commit crimes. They have to transgress the old laws to make new laws, destroy the present for the sake of the better. And all that compassion, all that generosity, that was really driven by pride. And those things were just tools that Raskolnikov was using to acquire his power. He had been hiding in plain sight this whole time. And he tells Sonia, the woman that he loves, that he wanted to be like Napoleon. And that's why he killed the old lady, to prove to himself that he was one of those great men. Now, here is the most important part of the book. Raskolnikov, he's tried, he's found guilty. They send him off to prison in Siberia. His lawyer tries to get him off on a plea of mental illness, But Raskolnikov refuses to defend himself to other people. He admits that he's guilty. He gets sent off to the prison. However, on the other hand, he still refuses to admit this to himself. He's in the Siberian prison, wasting away. And he's still asking himself, why is everyone acting like what I did so horrible? I didn't commit any real crime. I just messed up because I got caught. I should have never admitted it. He still refuses to accept the idea that he is not the author of his own values. And we're going to see here in the epilogue of the story, the most essential part of this book. Raskolnikov has this dream. It's a vision of what type of future awaits the world that won't let go of this rational, atheistic worldview. And listen to this. Keep in mind all of the events that have happened over the past 5 or 6 years. Protest in the streets turning into violent mobs. Cancel culture, not only between groups, but within groups. COVID mandates, wars that aren't being fought with bullets anymore, but with microbes, and authority figures invoking science to gain control of the population. Listen to this. He dreamed that the whole world was condemned to a terrible and strange new plague that had come to Europe from the depths of Asia. Some new microbe was attacking people's bodies, but these microbes were endowed with intelligence and will. Men had never considered themselves so intellectual, so completely in possession of the truth. They felt themselves to be infallible. Whole villages, whole towns, whole peoples were driven mad by this infection. Everyone was so excited, and they didn't understand one another. They didn't know how to judge and couldn't agree what to consider evil and what good. They didn't know who to blame or who to justify. They gathered together in their armies, but on the march, the armies would begin to attack one another. They were devouring each other. Who was summoning them? No one knew. They abandoned their ordinary trades. Conflagrations and famine ensued, and all men and all things were involved in destruction.